We're surrounded by a lot of warning signs. We have in our car, there's a warning signal that will go off if there's something wrong. We have carbon monoxide detectors just in case it gets a little too high. It will let us know that there's a danger level. When Grace is jumping up on the bed, we will warn her when she gets too close to the edge that if she's not careful, she's going to fall off. And she'll look at us and go, Grace fall off? Grace fall on the floor and go boom? And Grace get a boo-boo? And we're like, yeah, Grace will get a boo-boo and go boom if you don't be careful. We're surrounded by warning signs. Well, where we're at in the book of Colossians, Paul is warning them. He's throwing up these warning signs to make sure they're prepared for what may come their way. So let us step back for a second and see kind of where we come from. Paul is writing this letter to the church in Colossians. He's writing this letter to really fight against the Gnostic movement. The Gnostics taught that everything that was flesh was evil. So Jesus couldn't have come in the flesh because that would have been evil. So he was just an apparition. He came in the spirit. He didn't truly die. He didn't really truly rise from the grave either because he didn't come in the flesh. But they also taught that Jesus isn't enough. Jesus is maybe that first step on the ladder to God, but he's not God. He's not enough. You need more. So that's what Paul's fighting against here. He's warning them for what's coming. And one of the first things that he warns them with here in Colossians chapter 2 is he says, let no one judge you. It's a warning against legalism. He says, therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Paul points out two things here that they shouldn't be judged for. The first thing they shouldn't be judged for is their diet, what they eat. They was trying to teach them that they needed to go back and to follow the Old Testament dietary laws. Because following them would somehow enhance their relationship with God. And as we know, the Old Testament, they had categorized certain food as clean, other food as unclean, and there could be many reasons for this. Some believe because the unclean food just wasn't good for them to eat. And staying away from that really helped them physically. But even more than that, many believed that it was to help keep them pure. That if they would eat the other foods, then they would mingle with the other cultures and they would become unclean. So God was trying to separate them. But either way, when Jesus came, he fulfilled that. He did away with the dietary laws. Jesus told the Pharisees one time, are you so dull? Do you see that nothing that enters a man from the outside can make him unclean? For it doesn't go into his heart, but into his stomach, and then out of his body. In saying this, Jesus declared all food clean. Peter really struggled with this too. In the book of Acts, Peter has this vision where the sheet comes down. It's got all sorts of animals on it, and a voice tells him to kill and eat. And Peter says, I've never eaten anything that is unclean. I can't do that. And the voice says, don't call anything unclean that I have made clean. And with Peter's personality, it takes him 3 times for him to get it. 3 times the sheet comes down. 3 times he says, I have not eaten anything unclean. 3 times the voice tells him, don't call anything unclean that I have made clean. Paul understood this later. In Corinthians he would write, but food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and we're no better if we do. The New Testament is really unified on this idea that the dietary laws are gone. They're not there anymore, and they shouldn't be there to judge a person who doesn't follow them. Now, of course, dietary principles might be a good idea. Got a call a couple of weeks ago from my doctor that said I got high cholesterol, so I need to start watching what I eat. So watching what you eat may be a good idea. Too many Twinkies may be a bad idea. But we're not to judge others for what they eat or what they don't eat. We're not to allow anyone else to pass judgment on us. But Paul goes on and he says the same thing applies today. The Jews, they had their special feasts, their new moon celebrations, their Sabbaths. And when Jesus came, he fulfilled all of those. We no longer celebrate the Sabbath because now worship is on the Lord's Day. It's on the first day of the week. It's on the day that we remember the resurrection of Christ. And anyway, Paul says that all of these things are just a shadow of the true thing. All of these festivals, all of this dietary law, all of these things were just a shadow of the real thing, which is Christ. The dietary laws, they made the people sensitive to purity. The great feast taught them various aspects of Jesus and his work. It was all a shadow to point toward the real, point toward Jesus. The idea that spirituality can be measured provides an unfortunate bias for pride, for a judgmental attitude. The flesh finds it very difficult to do spiritual things. But we're really good at following rules and regulations and forcing others to try to follow those rules and regulations too. There seems to be this draw to legalism. And defining legalism isn't always easy. But let me try. This is the way I would define legalism. Legalism would be trying to follow the letter of the law instead of the spirit of the law. What I mean by that is the Old Testament and Leviticus is not a legal textbook. It wasn't written to cover every single possible thing that could take place. What it was written for was to show us what type of people live as God's people. How it looks to live in a community that's unified and that is pointing the world toward God. That's what it's here for. Not so that we can follow the letter of the law and say, look at me of everything that I do, but rather that we will become the type of person where following the law just naturally comes. It's just who we are. It just flows from us. But legalism also has this attitude toward it that I can earn my salvation. Or I can earn merit with God. I will do all of these things because I am earning something with God. And we can't earn anything with God. He's already given it to us freely. So legalism, it spawns this judgmental attitude that we look down on others because they're not matching up with what we think they should be doing. So we judge them. We point out the flaws. Legalism just sucks the joy out of life. Legalism demands uniformity. That we all act the same, that we all look the same, that we all do the same things. But that's just not Christianity. Now understand me, there's unity, but there's not uniformity. There's a difference. We're united, we're one body, but we're also individual people. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 points that out. It shows that we are one, but we are also unique. We're different. Legalism, it produces a surface level faith. Its adherence to some of the rules and regulations that they see is the most important oftentimes has them missing some of the deadly sins, like coveting, gossiping, slander, bitterness, hatred. Legalism produces a shallow faith. We're so quick to point out the flaws of others, but we miss those things in our own life that is just destructive. There's a surface level faith. That's why I find it interesting why Paul doesn't tell them to forbid the faithful from keeping these special days, but rather don't let anybody judge you for those. There's some liberty here. If you want to follow them, because you know what they mean, you understand them, they're pointing you to Christ. If you want to follow them, then go for it. If you don't, don't. Don't let anybody judge you for what you do or what you don't do. And this is a warning that we should take to heart, because time and time again, legalism has crept into the church, and the church has become judgmental, and joyless, and shallow in faith. But Paul also goes on and he says, let no one disqualify you. It's a warning against mysticism. Now, before we explore this idea, we need to understand that Christian mysticism isn't a bad thing in and of itself. But let me define what mysticism is. Mysticism is a doctrine of immediate spiritual intuition of truth, believed to transcend ordinary understanding or of a direct, intimate union of the soul with God through contemplation or ecstasy. Christian mysticism that helps us to try to better understand God, to understand our union with Him. There's nothing wrong in that. But the mysticism that's deceptive, that was being taught by the Gnostics, that is not rooted in Christ and who He is. It's just deception. It's just pretend. It's much like the old coach Johnny Kerr, who coached the Chicago Bulls. They had been on a 7-game losing streak, and he was trying to think of different ways to really prep up his team. So he tells one of them to go out and to pretend that they are the best scorer in the game. He tells another one to pretend that they're the best defensive guard. He tells another one to pretend that they can run a better offense than any other guard that's out there. He tells another player that he's to pretend that he is the best rebounder, shot blocker, scoring center in all of the game. But they lost by 17 points. And the coach was pacing back and forth in the locker room after the game, and one of the players came up to him, put his arm around him, and said, "It's okay, coach. Just pretend that we won." The Gnostics, they were great at pretending. They fooled not only themselves, they fooled many others as well. Paul says that the Colossians were in danger of being deprived of their reward and of their future glory by being deceived by their Gnostic friends. Verse 18, he says, "Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels, going on in detail about visions, puffed up without reason by a sensuous mind, and not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God." The Gnostics' power came from their approach to deceive. They would deceive that they had the best of humility, that they were so humble that they could not go to God themselves, that they had to go to the angels, and if they were in the right spirit, then maybe the angels would take their message to God. They seemed humble with their worship of angels. They seemed humble by the visions that they would talk about, being on a higher plane. But all of this is just a sham. In all reality, they were puffed up. They were conceited. But it drawed many people away because there is something enticing about the secrets of the spiritual world. Where the tarot cards, for example, has drawn many people away. Their design is meant to show mystery, and millions have followed it. Or the mystic signs of the zodiac have claimed many to follow them. Not only this, but their show of holiness, of self-righteousness was so attractive to many. So it would draw people to them, saying that they were the humblest people in town. And people would flock to them because they were afraid of missing out, of not being in that inner circle with everyone else. And C.S. Lewis, giving a guest lecture in 1944 to King's College, said that the desire to be in the inner circle, whatever that may be, is one of the great permanent mainsprings of human action. Of all passions, the passion for the inner ring is most skillful in making a man who is not yet a very bad man do very bad things. And when applied to religion, it's especially true. It has drawn so many people away. To have them turn away for something that's pretend. It's just not there. Much like the old fabled dog who was carrying a bone, but paused when it seen its reflection in a spring. And decided that it would go after that prize instead. And it dropped its bone to grab the bone that it seen in its reflection, and it lost its only prize that it had. Many have done the same. They have let go of the true reward for something that's just not there. And the root of the problem is laid bare in verse 19 when he says, "And not holding fast to the head, from whom the whole body, nourished and knit together through its joints and ligaments, grows with a growth that is from God." The false teachers had and still have no part in the true body of Christ. Their answers just does not stem in Him. And anyone who wants to stay away from that teaching must hold fast to Christ, who's the head. Lastly, Paul says, "Let no one enslave you." It's a warning against asceticism. Now, spiritual disciplines isn't bad. They're good. And Paul says in verse 20, "If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch," referring to things that are perishing as they are used. "According to human precepts and teachings, these have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh." Now, Paul talks about asceticism here. It's a word that maybe many of us don't know, but what it means a person who is so dedicated to their pursuit of God that they practice extreme self-denial or self-mortification for religious purposes. And sadly, church history has been filled with people like this, who has given up the beauty and the good things that God has given us in pursuit of what they believe to be God. So they reject marriage and parenthood and the beauty of God's creation, even rejecting self. Saint Anthony would go and live in the tombs. He wouldn't eat, he wouldn't drink very much. His followers would have to bring him bread. And they'd usually bring it to him maybe once a month, and the rest of the time he would spend in darkness by himself in the tombs. He saw the world as evil. So he had to get away from the world. It's the same belief that the Gnostics had. Everything that is physical is evil. There was another man who decided that he was going to try to get away, so he decided to live on, I think it was a 10-foot platform. Well, that 10-foot platform wasn't big enough, so he built a 100-foot platform. And they was afraid that he was going to fall off of it when he slept, so they tied a rope around him and the platform, so if he did fall, he wouldn't die. But he never cleaned, never bathed. And the place where the rope was began to get infected. I won't go into the details of all of it. It's quite disgusting, but he ended up priding himself of being food for the maggots and the other things who lived and ate on him from the infection. You see, he thought that self-discipline, that self-mortification, he thought that was actually make him more spiritual for God. And there's a problem here. There's nothing wrong with self-discipline. There's nothing wrong with the spiritual gifts. They should be admired. They should be practiced. But most things can be taken to extreme. And that's what we see here that Paul is warning against. Because when it's taken to extreme, two things happen. Once again, the attitude that I can earn my way to God on my own begins to creep in. The more I deny myself, the more spiritual I will become. But the other attitude is just a rejection of all of God's gifts. All of the things that God had created to bring joy to life, they claim to be evil and to be rejected. God's creation is evil. But the answer to such delusions, we need to remember what Paul says in verse 20 when he says, we have died with Christ to the basic or the elemental principles of this world. Because we died with Christ, they have no actual power over us. They do not help us to get closer to Him. Because He gets closer to us. Paul has sounded the alarms very clearly. He's calling us to look at things as they really are, not necessarily the way that we hope them to be. Several years ago, Royal Robbins, a professional mountain climber, wrote an article for Sports Illustrated, which demonstrates, I think, an important aspect of seeing ourselves and seeing reality for the way that it is, and not necessarily the way that we hope that it would be. He said, if we are keenly alert and aware of the rock and what we are doing on it, if we are honest with ourselves and our capabilities and weaknesses, if we avoid committing ourselves beyond what we know is safe, then we will climb safely. For climbing is an exercise in reality. He who sees it clearly is on safe ground, regardless of his experience or skill. But he who sees reality as he would like it to be may have his illusions rudely stripped from his eyes when the ground comes up fast. The reality is that in Christ all the fullness of the deity dwells bodily. And in Him, we have been made full. But we can lose the benefits of that. We can lose the fullness. We can fall into legalism, the self-righteousness, a joyless and judgmental attitude. We can succumb to mysticism and develop this proud, elitist spirit which contradicts true worship. We can think that self-denial or spiritual actions makes us more holy, when actually they just feed our pride. And the answer to all of these, if we go back, can be found at the beginning, where it all began, can be found at the foot of the cross. You see, the foot of the cross is a reality check. It reminds us of who we are. It reminds us that we need a Savior. That on our own, we should be in that place. But it also reminds us of who He is. And the love that He has for each and every one of us. That He was willing to go to that cross and pay the penalty for us. Not so that we can earn it, but it's a gift that He wants to give us. If you want that gift, you can come now.